And welcome back. The International Day for People Living with Disabilities 2022 is our topic for conversation this day, with the theme Transforming Solutions for Inclusive Development in the Role of Innovation in Fueling and Accessing Equitable World. To discuss this conversation with me are two very critical individuals. One is a special needs educator. His name is Saleh Adamu. Saleh, it's good to have you with us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
And welcome. And also to discuss this conversation with me is a mother. Her name is Catherine Isang. She is with the Monitoring and Evaluation FCT Secondary Education Board. She is also the parent of a child that's living with a disability. Good afternoon and welcome to the show.
Thank you for giving me this time.
All right, so I'm going to start with you first of all, Madam. What is it? What will you, or how would you define a disability?
Well, I'll define disability as an impairment of a part of the body structure which does not allow the normal daily functioning of or activity of the individual.
Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, I'm going to ask a second question, which is a follow-up question. You're a mother of a child with disabilities. So I wanted you to tell us a little bit about that experience.
I will say that being a mother of a child living with disability is not very easy. First and foremost is when it comes to you that actually this child cannot or is a disabled child for whatever impairment it is, like maybe deafness or blindness, once it is confirmed to you.
Yeah.
The shock and accepting the reality is difficult. But with time, you have to move on. You have to accept the challenges that are there, because what is normal for daily activity, particularly like for a deaf child, ability to talk, communicate with the peers, other people around, and that child is not able to do that. So you find yourself at all time trying to be protective, trying to be a voice for that child. So that is one of the things, wherever that child is, there is need for you to be there, to give that attention, to be that voice for the child. So that is one challenge that is there as a parent of a child. And so even other parents with other forms of disability, like a child that needs to move with a wheelchair, you know, the parent has to be there, you know, move the child from one point to the other, a blind child, until that child is trained, has gone through some education to be able to know how to use the guide stick to move around. So these are some of the challenges. Thank you.
If you don't mind, I may ask a more direct question. What's the, sorry, it's rather emotional, having, you know, the conversation and imagining what it's like, you know, living with a disability, growing up, dealing with the normal challenges in life that we all have, and then dealing with extra ones. So I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, what's the disability your child has?
My son is a deaf child.
Okay. All right, so he's, okay, that's interesting. So you've been able to, where do you start? I mean, I'm just imagining the journey from getting him to be able to communicate with others, to building confidence. Take me a little more into the journey before we go into the topic of the day.
I'll first start with confirming to me or to us as a family that the child is a deaf child. Having a baby, and then you find out that the milestones that a child is supposed to achieve is not there at a certain age that a child is supposed to talk, communicate. And so for you as a mother, you get worried, and then you decide to go to the hospital to really assess the child. And then after some assessment, you know, and you know, some tests, then the doctors come telling you this child is hearing impaired, has hearing loss. And so that's the first point. It was difficult to accept that fact. Then we sat down as a family and we told ourselves this is the reality. And so we have to embrace this reality and then find a solution. Then what is the next step? So when the other kids have to leave for school, how do we manage this other child? Every day, as you know, we put the other kids to take them to school. This other child is there that needs also to be in school.
Yeah.
And so we decided to go around to, make findings where are the schools, because I remember that the doctor that first assessed the child told us that we should look for a special education center, and that, hit me so hard. For a child that was just 2 years plus. But then we moved from one point to the other, asking questions, going to the Ministry of Education, until, we got information of a school which is privately owned.
Yeah.
And then we put the child in the school. That was how we started education for the child. And then the other thing is this lack of early education for the disabled child.
Okay, so we're going to go in there, which is, before we get in there, because that is going to take us to the crux of part of our conversation this evening. So how did you innovate in your home to be able to adapt to this child's needs and to ensure that the child is able to adapt and live in the world as normal as possible?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. I want to say for us, when we embraced the fact that this is the reality on ground, we also went out looking for education for him. Where can this child be trained?
Yeah.
And then we also met the other kids. They were the senior ones. He was, the much younger one then.
Yeah.
And so everybody accepted that reality.
Yeah.
And then whenever we are out of home, and then we find people trying to talk to him, sometimes you have people maybe just saying, excuse me, and maybe he did not hear. Then you have somebody pushing. So you always have to stand in the gap, because there is that attitudinal barrier, for people living with disability.
And that's very critical, and it's something we don't talk about in society at all, the attitudinal barrier.
Yes.
People are generally impatient, they don't want it, they don't care initially, and sometimes even after they find out, they are too embarrassed to apologize, so they don't even, they just walk away. So it's something that we have to deal with a lot. Now, going from that to this year's theme, which is talking about innovation to make a world more accessible to everyone and equitable. What areas, how do you think we can innovate to ensure that the world becomes more accessible and equitable for people with disabilities?
First, for me, is creating an awareness for the society, removing the attitudinal barriers.
Okay.
One thing people must come to terms with is that disability, no one calls for it.
Yeah.
And that it can also happen to you at any point in life. People live in denial, and you hear somebody saying, God forbid. But you can have diabetes, and it can, lead to, sight loss, amputated limbs, and so that automatically puts you to be a disabled person. And so it's very important for people to accept others who have this disability. Then we will talk about the disabled people, the provision of, the right type of education, inclusive education. Because when a disabled child sits in the classroom with other children, they get along, they become friends.
Yes.
That child grows to accept that disabled child. It's no more something that the child looks at as being odd. And these children in the classroom are part of the society.
Yeah.
If a child in the class has a blind child as a friend, goes back home and with passion talks about his friend, gradually that family comes to accept that blind child.
Yeah.
And so all those attitudinal barriers gradually, will be removed. But right now, the important thing is education and awareness. Education for the disabled, persons or child, and then awareness for the society to accept the disabled person.
All right, interesting. I'm going to take the question further, this conversation, and going to ask that we expand it into 4 critical areas. We're going to talk, we've talked about one, which is education and access to education. We're going to talk about the area of access to information. We're going to talk about health, and we're going to talk about employment.
Yeah.
So how can we innovate in these areas? You can take them in any order that you like.
Okay, we've talked about education,
Yeah.
because when the people have education, when there is information out there, the person that's educated will be able to, read, understand, and take the information.
Yeah, but even under education, how can we innovate better in education? Yes, there are schools, but
Yes, I want to talk about some things in the education.
All right, please go ahead.
Policy-wise.
Yeah.
Policy-wise, you have the school systems. Even though there is an act, I must appreciate the president for the act, signing the law for disability. I appreciate that, and I also appreciate the president for the establishment of the Commission for Disability. But we need to move past the point of it being an act to the point of implementation.
Okay.
Because you still have, institutions that do not, they have not changed anything about their structures. We have, some barriers. We've talked about attitudinal barriers. We have physical and structural barriers where there are supposed to be ramps, where there are supposed to be, pathways created in the school for a child that uses a wheelchair. There is no such provision. If the classroom, for a child, or maybe a lab, a child is doing science, and the lab is upstairs, how does a child that is on a wheelchair have access to that? And so also for the provision of skilled teachers, special education teachers in the school, like a sign language interpreter for the deaf, even for communication for the blind child, provision of resource center, brailles, for the blind child. All these things are things that need to be provided in the schools. And then I also want to say something about, the aspect of education. The government is not providing schools.
Okay.
In FCT alone, you just have one school, which is at Kuje.
That's some distance.
And I had earlier mentioned early education. You can imagine me as a mother. I do not live at Kuje. How do I drive my child, of about 2 years, like a normal, any other normal child will be in the preschool, then drive that child to school every day from where I live to get to school at Kuje.
That's up to or more than 20 kilometers just
going.
going.
FCT is divided into districts, and so the plan for the district is that hospitals are provided for each district. School is provided for each district.
So the government should do more.
The government needs to do more
in the area of providing.
Yes, provision of school.
Okay, so talking about education, leaving education now, let's move to the other area where you talked about health.
Yes. Let me talk about health.
Okay.
In our hospitals also, we do not have provision for interpreters.
Oh, I see.
A deaf person cannot communicate. Mobility for the person that is on a wheelchair, to move about some places in the hospital, the floor levels are not the same. So creating pathways for that person on the wheelchair to move is not also there in the hospital. So these are, not proper access. And then there should be a desk officer that once someone with disability is around, it goes to that desk officer, just like for the provision for NHIS desk, officer. And then that person will be given the right, attention. Does he need a sign language interpreter? That provision will be made. Or this person is on a wheelchair. Does he need, to move okay, this is the path that you're going to go through to get to the lab. Or if it's a blind person, there is a guide for the blind person, not where the person arrives at the hospital and people are staring. And then you have some word where some medical, practitioners are so nasty and said, to a pregnant, how did she even get pregnant?
That's
Which is so
nasty.
Bad.
It is.
So such nasty comments comes up. Will you say that to the other person? Being a disabled person does not make the person half human.
No, it does not. It just
yes,
makes the person someone with a challenge. That's all.
So that is a normal human being, just like
anybody else. All right, because of time, I'm going to ask you to do two things as we try to round up the interview. A critical issue from our conversation has been the lack of empathy, the attitudinal awareness. I'm going to ask you to talk to people about the attitudinal awareness and trying to put themselves in other people's shoes, like you've mentioned, cases of the hospital, cases in school, cases on the street. I'm trying to give people with disabilities the understanding and the preference, if necessary, to be able to function normally without being condescending as we do so, and also talk about the very critical issue of the society being able to innovate to ensure that these people can live their normal lives. It's our responsibility as a people to do so. So can we round up talking about these two issues?
Okay. I want to say that there's need for people in the society to have an innovative mindset.
Okay.
To embrace inclusion.
Yes, sir.
Because when they have innovative mindsets, they will accept the people living with disability. The disabled persons, people with disability, are not low intelligent people. Mm-hmm. They are very intelligent and they are capable in their own areas. And so even in the areas of employment, where though the Act provide 5%, provision for the civil service, but this is not, is not seen, but we are believing with regulation, enforcement will take place, and all this will come to be. Just let everyone have an innovative mind and embrace the disabled person as not being half human, but being human just as you are.
Thank you very much, Catherine. It's been fascinating talking to you and enlightening, I would say. Your mind just opens, and sometimes you'd have to, hold back the tears as we talked about. And Saleh, I'd also like to thank you for being on the show and helping us with the interpretation. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. We hope forward to seeing you again so that we can talk more about this topic, and then we can push the conversation even forward.